Picture the Atlantic Ocean. It is 1922. A heavy fog sits on the water just 12 miles off the coast of Long Island. The sea is calm, dangerously calm. On the surface, you might see the faint outline of a fishing trawler, or perhaps a sleek speedboat with its engines cut, bobbing in the silence. They are waiting for something. They aren't waiting for a cargo ship. They aren't waiting for a schooner from the Caribbean. They are waiting for a shadow beneath the waves. And then the water breaks. A tower of gray steel rises from the depths, shedding gallons of seawater. It's mechanical, industrial, and utterly terrifying to anyone who remembers the Great War only a few years prior. It is a German Unterseeboot, a U-boat. But the hatch doesn't open to reveal a crew manning a deck gun. It opens to reveal a bucket brigade of sailors passing up crates of high-end Scotch whiskey. This sounds like absolute fiction. It sounds like a pulp novel from the 1930s or a conspiracy theory cooked up on an internet forum. But here is the reality. It happened. German submarines, the wolves of the Atlantic, were repurposed to breach the wall of American Prohibition. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most bizarre and overlooked chapters of maritime history. We are talking about the documented evidence of U-boat smuggling operations, the geopolitical desperation that drove Germany to do it, and the sheer engineering audacity required to turn a weapon of war into the ultimate rum runner. I'm Speaker One, and this is the story of how the German Navy infiltrated American waters, not for conquest, but for cash. Welcome to the show. To understand how a German submarine ends up selling booze off the coast of New York, we have to understand the world in 1919 and 1920. World War I has just ended. The Treaty of Versailles has absolutely decimated the German economy. The German Imperial Navy, once the pride of the Kaiser, is either scuttled at Scapa Flow or being chopped up for scrap metal. Right, Germany is in a state of hyperinflation. Their currency is becoming worthless wallpaper. You have thousands of highly trained naval officers, engineers, and submarine crews who are suddenly unemployed. These are men who know the Atlantic better than anyone. They know the currents, the depths, and the patrol routes, and they are hungry. At the same time, across the ocean, the United States passes the Volstead Act. Prohibition begins in 1920. America suddenly becomes the driest nation on Earth, legally speaking, but practically speaking, it becomes the thirstiest nation on Earth. The demand for alcohol didn't vanish, it skyrocketed, and the price went up with it. This created a massive economic vacuum. You have a product, alcohol, that is cheap to produce in Europe, and you have a market in America willing to pay astronomical prices for it. The only barrier is the Atlantic Ocean and the United States Coast Guard. Now, traditional smugglers used surface ships. They used schooners, fishing boats, steamships. But surface ships have a major flaw. They can be seen, they can be chased, they can be boarded. If a Coast Guard cutter spots you, you have to outrun them or surrender. But a submarine has the ultimate ace up its sleeve. It can simply disappear. Exactly. And this is where the technology comes in. We need to talk about the Deutschland. This wasn't just any submarine. In 1916, before the US even entered World War I, Germany built two massive merchant submarines, the Deutschland and the Bremen. These weren't built for torpedoes, they were built for cargo. That's a crucial distinction. Most people think of U-boats as cramped tubes full of torpedoes. The Deutschland class was different. It was wide, it was spacious, and it was designed specifically to break the British naval blockade. In 1916, the Deutschland actually sailed to Baltimore, popped up, unloaded chemical dyes, loaded up on nickel and rubber, and sailed back to Germany right under the noses of the British Navy.
It was a proof of concept. It proved you could move heavy cargo across the Atlantic underwater. After the war, the Deutschland was surrendered to the British and eventually scrapped. But the design, the blueprints, and the other hulls that were partially constructed, they didn't just vanish, and neither did the men who knew how to operate them. There are reports deep in the archives of the Office of Naval Intelligence suggesting that not all U-boats were accounted for, or more likely that private syndicates in Germany, desperate for foreign currency, managed to acquire or reactivate demilitarized subs. They stripped out the batteries to make room for cases of gin and whiskey. It's the perfect crime. A surface rum runner has to sit on Rum Row, that line 3 miles, later 12 miles out, and wait for contact boats. They are sitting ducks for the Coast Guard. A U-boat could submerge during the day, resting on the continental shelf, and only surface at night when the contact boats signaled. It was stealth logistics. Let's get into the specifics of how these operations worked. We have accounts from Coast Guard logs and even testimony from captured rum runners that paint a vivid picture. Imagine the logistics of loading a submarine with alcohol. You aren't just tossing bags in a truck. You have to balance the weight distribution perfectly. That's right, trim is everything in a submarine. If you load 5 tons of whiskey in the bow, you're going to nosedive into the bottom of the ocean. The German crews were meticulous. They packed cases of liquor into every available crevice. Torpedo tubes filled with bottles. The cruise bunks stocked with cases. Even the bilges were sometimes used for waterproof kegs. There is a specific incident that stands out. It involves a vessel identified by witnesses as a submarine-like craft off the coast of Cape Cod in 1923. Coast Guard cutters reported picking up engine noises on their hydrophones that didn't match any known surface engine. It was a heavy, rhythmic thrumming, the sound of huge diesel engines charging electric batteries. The contact boats, the fast speedboats run by American gangsters, would head out to a specific coordinate. They'd cut their lights. They would signal with a specific pattern of flashes, a red light, then 2 greens. Suddenly, the water would churn. The U-boat would blow its ballast tanks. The hatch would open, and you'd have German sailors, speaking little to no English, forming a line. The transfer had to be fast. They were exposed. If a Coast Guard searchlight hit them, the submarine had a protocol: crash dive. They wouldn't wait for the money. They wouldn't wait for the Americans to get off the deck. They would just pull the plug. There are stories of gangsters being dragged underwater or left swimming because the sub-captain got spooked. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the disparity in alcohol seizures. The government was seizing huge amounts of alcohol, but they were barely catching any large ships. They were catching the small contact boats. The math didn't add up. Where were the motherships? The motherships weren't there because they were underwater. We also have to talk about the phantom fleets. In 1924, there were reports from commercial liners of seeing submarines in the shipping lanes that didn't fly any flag. When approached, they submerged. The US Navy wasn't running drills there. The British Navy wasn't there. Who else had submarines capable of transatlantic travel? Only the Germans. And let's not forget the sheer value of the cargo. A single U-boat could carry, let's say, 25,000 cases of liquor if stripped properly. In 1920 money, that cargo is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Today, that's millions. It was worth the risk of a transatlantic voyage in a rust bucket submarine. There was also a strange diplomatic incident where the U.S. State Department quietly inquired with the Weimar government about the location of certain scrap hulls. The Germans, of course, claimed everything was accounted for, but the inquiry itself proves the U.S. government suspected it. So if this was happening, why don't we learn about it in history class? Why is this treated as a footnote or a tall tale? The answer lies in the embarrassment of the authorities.
Absolutely. Think about the optics. The United States had just won the war to end all wars. They had the most powerful navy in the world. To admit that defeated German sailors were penetrating U.S. territorial waters, selling booze to American citizens, and slipping away undetected, it was a national security nightmare. It suggested the U.S. coast was defenseless against submarines. It was better to blame crafty local smugglers than to admit a foreign power, or at least rogue elements of a foreign power, were operating with impunity. So the reports were filed away. The submarine sightings were dismissed as sea monsters or fatigue. Furthermore, the Germans had zero incentive to admit it. They were trying to rebuild international relations. Smuggling was a violation of U.S. sovereignty. If the Weimar Republic admitted they couldn't control their own decommissioned navy, or worse, that they were tacitly allowing it to boost their economy, it could have triggered severe sanctions. But the legacy of this technology lived on. This was the birth of the narco-sub concept we see today. The idea that submersibles are the ultimate smuggling tool started right here in the Roaring '20s with German engineering and American thirst. Modern divers have even found debris fields that don't match known shipwrecks, scattered metal and glass in areas where U-boats were rumored to offload. We are still finding the physical footprints of these ghost ships today. The operation eventually died out not because they were caught, but because Prohibition ended. Once alcohol was legal again, the profit margin for a submarine voyage evaporated. The U-boats went back to the scrapyards, or were hidden away until the rise of the Third Reich, when they would return to the American coast for a very different and much darker purpose. They were the ghosts of the Prohibition era, steel sharks filled with liquid gold, a conspiracy of silence between German sailors and American gangsters that history almost forgot. But the evidence is there.
rusting on the ocean floor, reminding us that where there is a demand, someone will always build a machine to supply it. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into history. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us for more untold stories. Imagine, if you will, the coast of Long Island in the dead of winter, 1924. The Atlantic Ocean is a churning, freezing void. On the surface, the United States Coast Guard is patrolling with everything they have. They have cutters, they have refurbished destroyers, and they have searchlights sweeping the waves looking for the telltale silhouette of a rum runner schooner. It's a game of cat and mouse. The rum runners stayed just outside the 3-mile limit, later the 12-mile limit, on what was known as Rum Row. They wait for smaller, faster boats to zip out, load up, and sprint back to shore before the feds can catch them. Exactly. It was a surface war. It was loud, it was visible, and it was dangerous. But while the Coast Guard was scanning the horizon, looking for masts and smoke, something else was happening beneath their keels, something that sounds like pure fiction until you open the declassified files. We are talking about the ultimate stealth delivery system: German U-boats, submarines, designed for warfare, repurposed for the most lucrative trade of the 20th century, smuggling high-end liquor into dry America. It sounds absolutely insane, doesn't it? When you hear U-boat, you think of Wolfpacks in World War II or the Lusitania in World War I. You don't think of a German military vessel surfacing off the Jersey shore to offload cases of schnapps and champagne. But that is exactly what makes this story so compelling. It's the collision of military technology and organized crime. And let's be clear about the scale of this. We aren't talking about a couple of guys in a homemade submersible. We are talking about state-of-the-art naval engineering. This is a story that has been dismissed as a conspiracy theory for decades, often lumped in with sea monster sightings. But the evidence suggests that not only was it possible, it was a geopolitical strategy.
That's the hook. Why would Germany, a nation recovering from the devastation of the Great War, risk an international incident by sending submarines to smuggle booze? The answer lies in the economics of the Weimar Republic, which we will get to. But first, we have to establish that this actually happened, because for a long time, the US government flat out denied it.
Denial was the default setting. Admitting that foreign submarines could penetrate US territorial waters with impunity, even if just to deliver scotch, would have been a political nightmare. It would have signaled to the world that the American coastline was defenseless against underwater threats. So the official line was always rumors and tall tales. But the logs tell a different story. Let's go back to the documented evidence. To understand how a U-boat becomes a rum runner, we have to look at the precedent. This didn't start in the 1920s. The proof of concept actually occurred in 1916, before the US even entered World War I. Right, the merchant submarine Deutschland. This is a vessel that everyone forgets about. We think of submarines strictly as hunters, carrying torpedoes. But the Deutschland and her sister ship, the Bremen, were built specifically as cargo carriers. They were massive, unarmed submarines designed to break the British naval blockade. The Deutschland is critical here. In July 1916, this massive submarine just pops up in Baltimore Harbor. The crew steps out, they shake hands with the locals, and they unload a cargo worth millions: dyes, chemicals, mail, and then they load up with nickel, tin, and rubber and dive back under the Atlantic to go home. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that a submarine could cross the Atlantic, dock in America, trade, and leave, all while avoiding the British Navy. It was a technological marvel, and it planted a seed. When Prohibition hit in 1920, the infrastructure for underwater commerce was already theoretically proven. The Deutschland showed that you could move high-value, low-volume cargo via submarine. And in the 1920s, there was no cargo with a higher value-to-volume ratio than authentic European liquor. So fast forward to the Prohibition era. You have the Rum Row anchored offshore. It's chaotic. Hijackings are common. The Coast Guard is getting better at intercepting surface ships. If you are a major syndicate, or perhaps a desperate foreign government looking for hard currency, the surface is becoming too hot. You need a new route. Enter the surplus U-boats. After World War I, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was supposed to surrender its U-boat fleet. Most were scrapped or taken by the Allies. But the accounting, let's just say it was creative. Components went missing, hulls were unaccounted for. And the expertise, the men who knew how to operate these machines, they were out of work and broke. We have reports from Coast Guard cutters in 1923 and 1924 describing low-profile vessels that could submerge when approached.
One specific report from a cutter off the coast of Massachusetts details a chase with a vessel that didn't just outrun them, it vanished beneath the waves. The captain's log noted it looked exactly like a pre-war German U-boat. And then there are the civilian sightings. Fishermen in Nova Scotia and down the eastern seaboard reported seeing submarines surfacing at night to meet with smaller, high-speed motorboats. These weren't American naval subs. The U.S. Navy logs show their subs were docked miles away. These were unidentified, dark gray hulls, often with no markings, conducting ship-to-ship transfers in the dead of night. The mechanics of it are fascinating. How do you transfer crates of glass bottles from a submarine to a boat in the open ocean? You can't just use a crane. The U-boats would surface, usually in calm waters or the lee of a larger ship, and open the torpedo loading hatches. These hatches were designed to slide massive torpedoes into the hull, so sliding crates out was actually quite efficient. They also used waterproof canisters. This was a technique developed during the war for supplying agents. They would seal the alcohol in buoyant, watertight drums. The submarine could stay submerged, eject DPAMs through the torpedo tubes or a dedicated lock, and the contact boat on the surface would simply fish them out of the water. Zero visual contact required between the vessels.
That is incredibly sophisticated for the time. It implies a level of coordination that goes beyond your average gangster. This suggests naval training.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the geopolitical angle. Why would German crews be involved in this? We have to look at Germany in the early 1920s. Hyperinflation. The mark was worthless. People were burning wheelbarrows of cash just to stay warm. The country was destitute. But the United States was booming, the roaring 20s, and the US dollar was strong. If you were a German naval officer or a shipping magnate with access to demilitarized submarine technology, the American thirst for alcohol was a gold mine. You could trade cheap German potato schnapps or French wine, which you could buy for pennies in Europe, for stacks of US dollars. There is a theory supported by some intelligence archives that the Weimar government, or at least rogue elements within the German military establishment, turned a blind eye to this or even facilitated it. It was a way to bring hard foreign currency back into Germany. It was a block market bailout. It makes sense. Smuggling was one of the few industries where Germany still had a competitive advantage. Their submarine technology. They had the best boats and the best crews. Why let that go to waste when you can fund your recovery with gin? We also have to talk about the phantom fleets. In 1924, there was a massive investigation regarding a fleet of ships allegedly registered in foreign ports but owned by German interests, specifically designed to supply the rum row. Intelligence reports from the time suggest that among this surface fleet, there were at least 2 operational submarines acting as blockade runners for the most valuable cargo. The specific submarine often cited in the conspiracy circles is a modified U-151 class. These were the cruiser submarines. They had a huge range, something like 12,000 miles. They could leave Hamburg, cross the Atlantic, loiter off the coast of New York for weeks, and return without refueling. A standard coastal bootlegger couldn't do that. And let's not forget the sheer capacity. A U-151 class could carry hundreds of tons of cargo. If you fill that with high-end scotch, you are looking at a profit margin that justifies the risk of the voyage 100 times over. One successful trip could set the crew up for life in hyperinflationary Germany. So the motive is there, the means are there, the sightings are there. Why did the US government bury it? Why do we not read about the submarine rum war in history books? It comes down to fear. In the 1920s, the US was isolationist. The idea that a foreign power could operate military-grade vessels in American waters with impunity was terrifying. If the public knew that German U-boats were surfacing off Long Island, the demand wouldn't be "stop the booze," it would be "where is the Navy?" It would have exposed a massive gap in national defense. The Coast Guard was equipped to stop fishing boats, not submarines. Admitting the problem existed would force the government to admit they couldn't solve it. It was easier to classify the reports as misidentified whales or drunken hallucinations by local fishermen. There is also the diplomatic angle. Relations with Germany were fragile. Accusing the Weimar Republic of state-sponsored smuggling would have caused a diplomatic rift that neither side wanted. The US wanted Germany to pay reparations, not start a trade war over whiskey. But the cover-up wasn't perfect. We have the shakedown stories. There are accounts from legitimate rum runners, if you can call them that, complaining about the Germans. American gangsters didn't like the competition. They controlled the surface. The underwater route undercut their prices and their control. That's a great point. Organized crime in the US was territorial. If a U-boat surfaces and sells directly to independent distributors, bypassing the mob's distribution network on the surface, that's bad for business. There are legends of mob bosses actually tipping off the Coast Guard to the location of these submarines just to get rid of the competition. The enemy of my enemy is the Coast Guard. That is hilarious. But let's look at the modern discoveries. How do we know this isn't just folklore? Have we found the wrecks?
This is where it gets really interesting. In recent decades, divers and marine archaeologists have found anomalies off the East Coast, unidentified debris fields that match German naval architecture but don't correspond to known WW1 or WW2 battle sites. There is a wreck off the coast of New Jersey that has long been debated. Officially, it's often listed as unknown or misidentified, but the dimensions and the machinery found match the cargo arrangements of the commercial U-boats. And we have seen bottles recovered from these sites, haven't we? Bottles that date specifically to the Prohibition era, found in the hold of what looks like a military vessel. Exactly. You find a debris field with German engineering in crates of 1922 vintage champagne. It puts two and two together. It's not a smoking gun maybe, but it's a smoking bottle. There was also a specific incident in 1921 involving the tugboat Perth Amboy. It was fired upon by a submarine off Cape Hatteras. Initially, everyone thought World War I mine or leftover danger, but the ballistics and the description of the vessel that surfaced to check the damage pointed to a U-boat. In 1921, the war had been over for 3 years. What was a U-boat doing there unless it was conducting illicit trade? It's the Phantom War of Prohibition. We focus so much on the speakeasies and the Tommy guns, we forget the maritime complexity. The U-boat smuggling operation was the high-tech, high-stakes tier of the black market. It really changes how you view the era. It wasn't just guys in jalopies outrunning the police, it was international naval espionage, and the legacy of this technology didn't end with Prohibition. No, it didn't. The lessons learned by these German crews, how to evade U.S. coastal patrols, the thermal layers of the water off the American coast, the hiding spots, all of that data went back to Germany. And when World War II started and Operation Drumbeat began, the U-boat assault on America's East Coast, the captains had surprisingly detailed charts and knowledge of the waters. That is a chilling thought, that the smuggling runs of the 1920s were effectively reconnaissance missions for the war in the 1940s. It's highly probable. The captains who cut their teeth smuggling gin to New York were the senior commanders teaching the Wolfpacks how to hunt off North Carolina 20 years later. The alcohol run was the training ground. So we have a story that encompasses economic desperation, technological innovation, government cover-ups, and the seeds of a future war, all wrapped around a bottle of illegal booze. It's the ultimate untold story of the Atlantic. And the more we explore the ocean floor with modern sonar and ROVs, the more likely we are to find one of these alcohol subs intact, sitting in the mud, still full of contraband. A time capsule of the Roaring '20s, sealed in a German steel tube. Now, I want to pivot slightly to the specifics of the submarines themselves. We mentioned the U-151 class, but there were smaller boats involved too, according to some theories. Yes, the UB-3 class. These were coastal submarines, much smaller, harder to detect. The theory is that they would be towed across the Atlantic by larger motherships, surface freighters, and then released near the U.S. coast to make the final run into shallow waters where the big destroyers couldn't follow. That solves the fuel problem. If you towed a sub, it arrives with full tanks ready to maneuver and hide. It's a parasite strategy. Precisely, and the UB-3 was small enough to sit on the bottom in shallow water, wait for the Coast Guard to pass overhead, and then pop up right next to a pier or a waiting truck convoy on a secluded beach. It was the perfect delivery vehicle. Imagine being a Coast Guardsman in 1925. You are looking for a schooner, you are looking for sails, and right under your boat, 10 meters down, a German crew is eating sausages and waiting for you to leave so they can unload $50,000 worth of whiskey.
It must have been infuriating for the authorities. They knew something was happening. The amount of alcohol flooding the market was too high to be explained by surface ships alone. The math didn't add up. Submarines were the variable that balanced the equation. And the press at the time, did they pick up on this, or was it totally suppressed? There were tabloids that ran with it. Hun subs return headlines. But the reputable papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they generally treated it with skepticism, likely at the urging of the State Department. They called them sea serpent stories. It was a way to discredit the witnesses, gaslighting the American public to protect the illusion of border security, a tale as old as time. But the fishermen knew. The people who lived on the water knew. You can't fake the sound of ballast tanks blowing at 2 a.m. You can't fake the smell of diesel and damp steel wafting across the water on a fogless night. As we wrap up this investigation, it's worth noting that this technology eventually became the standard for modern drug smuggling. The narco subs we see today in South America, they are the direct spiritual successors to these Prohibition U-boats. History repeats itself. The cargo changes from rum to cocaine, but the method remains the same. The underwater domain is the final frontier for smuggling because it is the hardest to police. But the German U-boats of the 1920s did it with a level of style and engineering that a fiberglass narco sub just can't match. There is a romance to it. The dark hull, the brass fittings, the sheer audacity of the Imperial Navy turning into bootleggers. It's a story of survival. For the crews, it was about feeding their families in a broken Germany. For the Americans, it was about getting a drink in a dry country. And in the middle, the Atlantic Ocean kept the secrets. So the next time you look out at the ocean, remember, the surface is only half the story. Down in the deep, history is still waiting to be discovered. Thanks for joining us on this dive into the deep end of Prohibition. Stay dry, everyone, or wet, depending on your preference.
It sounds completely insane. We usually think of U-boats hunting convoys, not delivering scotch to the eastern seaboard. But by 1916, the British blockade was strangling Germany. They were desperate for hard currency to survive. And America, officially neutral, was thirsty. But submarines are tiny inside and claustrophobic. How do you pack enough alcohol to make the trip worth it without compromising the crew? That is the engineering brilliance. We aren't talking about standard attack boats. Germany developed the Handels-U-Boote, merchant submarines. The famous Deutschland was a beast built to slip under the blockade. It wasn't armed with torpedoes, it was armed with massive cargo space designed for trade. So essentially an underwater semi-truck. That changes the picture completely. Exactly. When the Deutschland arrived in Baltimore in July 1916, the crew were rock stars. The manifest listed chemical dyes and mail, but reports from dock workers and hushed rumors strongly suggested something else was tucked deep in those holds, cases of high-end spirits. It makes sense economically. If you can only make one trip undetected, you bring goods with the highest markup. But if they were celebrated openly, this wasn't exactly a secret mission. The arrival wasn't secret, but the illicit cargo definitely was. The US was walking a tightrope of neutrality. If the government admitted they were allowing German subs to smuggle contraband right under the Royal Navy's nose, it would have been a total diplomatic disaster for everyone involved.